Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and today we are on What Katy Did Next, which is get to go on a trip to Europe. So I should mention that each of the Katy books does tend to start with a brief adventure of some sort that doesn't necessarily directly, have to do with, the main story. Or sort of that there's it goes one way and then there's a turn where all of a sudden things start to happen. It's usually a very distinct thing in these books. Anyways, so in this one we meet Mrs. Ashe and her daughter Amy, and what happens is Mrs. Ashe's little nephew, cousin, something, her cousin or her husband's cousin, I don't know. Anyways, his son Walter winds up staying with Mrs. Ashe, and then he gets very, very ill, and so Mrs. Ashe basically has to boot her daughter Amy out of the house, and Amy goes to stay at Dr. Carr's home. So while Dr. Carr is treating Mrs. Ashe's nephew Walter, Amy is becoming, in a way, part of the Carr family. And after all of this stuff, Mrs. Ashe asks if she can take Katy on a trip to Europe with her, because she wants to go to Europe, she wants to have a change, but she also wants someone else with her, because, let's be honest, you don't want to be taking care of Amy, who is, I believe, 8 years old at this time, all by yourself in a foreign country. And Dr. Carr, he thinks about it, but when Katy starts to get concerned about how everybody's going to do without her, that's the point that, much like in What Katy Did at School, her father puts his foot down and basically says she needs to be her age. She's just barely 20 years old. She shouldn't be acting like an exhausted 50-year-old housewife. And so he says, no, you go to Europe. So Mrs. Ashe, who has after all promised to pay for everything, takes Katy to Europe. And before they go to Europe, however, they stop off in Boston, which is where Rose Red is. Rose, as if you will recall from last week, is my favorite character of all time. And Rose, in this, has my favorite speech from Rose. I love the second book best because it has the most Rose in it, but I love this speech. I love it so much. Rose has gotten married to a lovely man named Denniston Brown. She is now Rose Brown, which nobody calls her that because it sounds weird. And Rose is living in the suburbs. And then she starts, and, Katy feels that nobody in the world could possibly be having such a good time as Rose, and then Rose launches into this wonderful overwrought speech. And I'm going to read the whole thing because I love it. It's all very well now, she said, that is Rose, while the warm weather lasts, but in winter long what is simply gruesome. The wind never stops blowing day nor night. It howls and it roars and it screams, till I feel as if every nerve in my body were on the point of snapping in two. And the snow, and the wind, and burglars. Every night of our lives they come, or I think they come, and I lie awake and hear them sharpening their tools and forcing the locks, and murdering the cook and kidnapping baby, till I long to die and have done with them forever. Oh, nature is the most unpleasant thing. Burglars are not nature, objected Katy. What are they then, art? High art? Well, whatever they are, I do not like them. Oh, if ever the happy day comes when Denniston consents to move into town, I never wish to set my eyes on the country again so long as I live, unless, well, yes, I should like to come out just once more on the horse cars and kick that elm tree by the fence. The number of times that I have lain awake at night listening to its creaking. You might kick it without waiting to have a house in town. Oh, I shouldn't dare as long as we are living here. You never know what nature may do. She has ways of her own of getting even with people, remarked her friend solemnly. This is Rose in a nutshell. This is all that makes up Rose. It's just such wonderful, over-the-top drama, and I love it. Anyways, so then Katy goes to London, goes to to Europe, and they go to London, and London is wet because it's London. And Amy is not nearly as happy in London or in Paris, which turns out to be wet and gray too, as the adults, because, well, adults can enjoy things that 8-year-olds can't, because 8-year-olds, maybe they're not mature enough, or maybe they're smart enough to realize that looking at a bunch of old buildings is staring at a bunch of old buildings. Who knows? But Katy and Mrs. Ashe do their best, and eventually they make their way through various places until they get, oh yes, and here, this is a spoiler for the end of the book, actually. This cover page in the midst of my little 4-book series. They kind of throw that in there, and it's totally a spoiler. We'll get there when we get there. See, this is Katy finally getting on board the boat that will take her to Boston, and from Boston, then they will get on another boat to take them, that will take them the rest of the way to Europe. And so here they are in so-called storybook England, where when the weather is just so awful that they can't do all the things that they'd planned to do, a lovely American gentleman who lives in London suggests that they do a bunch of things. You may recognize this picture from the cover. This is the whole picture, but without the color. He suggests that they do things like visit places that they recognize from books, streets from books, places where interesting things happened or where authors did interesting things, and so they do that. And they have their own interesting, literarily connected tours. Anyways, but eventually they get to Nice, which is in the south of France, and it is warm and sunny, and there are beaches, and it's great. And Polly's brother finally shows up. Ned Worthington shows up, and he meets up with his sister and with Katy, and they also at the same time meet up with Olivia and Lily Page. You remember Cousin Olivia and her daughter Lily? Well, they're rich people, and they're kind of a lot of the bad stereotypes about rich people. They're stuck up, they're obsessed with buying things. Their trip to Europe has not been, oh yes, I saw this lovely museum. It's all been, this is where I got this lovely dress. But Lily is gorgeous, and so Ned has been courting her. And then one day it turns, and what happens is Lily, who has been feeling something in a snit because Ned Worthington wants to spend time with his sister, which he's in the military, he doesn't get to see his sister very often. He is in fact a lieutenant in the army, in the Navy rather, pardon me, and so he doesn't get to see his sister Polly often. And so he's spending a lot of time with her, and consequently, because Katy is traveling with Mrs. Ashe, she's spending a lot of time with Katy, and so Lily gets a bee in her bonnet, and when there is a party on board one of the naval vessels, as pictured here somewhat, she decides to give him the cold shoulder as punishment for not paying enough attention to her. He immediately winds up spending time with Katy instead, pictured here. And Katy is kind and charming and genteel and intelligent, and no, she can't dance, and no, she isn't as objectively gorgeous as Lily, but she's lovely and restful, and he has a long conversation with her, and that is where things start to change for Ned. We don't come back to this budding romance until much, much later. They continue traveling onward, visit Italy, see all kinds of interesting and exciting things in Italy, and then Amy becomes dangerously ill when they're in Rome. And they're there, and this scene is another scene of great drama that happens in this book, in which, and the thing is that Katy has to defend the the landlady of the hotel that they're staying in, the woman in charge of it, has basically said, I will not have a sick child, a seriously ill child, in my hotel, and tries to throw them out. And Katy's like, you're not going to pitch us out while the child is dangerously ill. She literally can't be moved. Don't forget, this is not the modern era. You can't just take her to a hospital and get her better treatment. She will, in fact, be best treated if she stays put. And Katy defends the door, keeps the woman from going in there, and then the doctor shows up, and when Italian meets Italian, then comes the tug of expletive. It did not take 1 second for Dr. Hilary to whirl the padrona out at the entry, where they could be heard going at each other like two furious cats. Hiss, roll, sputter, recrimination, objurgation. Prestige of thy miserable hotel, he thundered. Where will that be when I go and tell the English and Americans, all of whom I know every one, how thou hast served a countrywoman of theirs in thy house? Dost thou think thy prestige will help thee much when Dr. Hilary has fixed a black mark on thy door? It goes on. It's something that kind of needs a just hardcore Shakespearean male actor to go for broke and chew the scenery, really, to give it full justice. It's marvelous and dramatic and also a little hilarious. But what happens is Ned Worthington shows up in time to see Katy facing down this woman, to see her arguing with her and keeping her from disturbing his niece, and that's when he falls in love with her, when he sees her as just this immovable wall of fire that will not let this woman harm his family. And after that, he starts courting her. And by the end of this book, she and Ned are engaged, although admittedly it is merely implied at the end of this book, because after Amy is ill, the trip to Europe gets cut short because Mrs. Ashe says, my nerves are shot. Because they had a very, very tough time. I mean, imagine being ill in a foreign country, but not merely ill, having trouble finding all of the things you consider a necessity in the sick room because you are in a foreign country where they don't do the same things. And so Mrs. Ashe is exhausted. She can't take it anymore, and when she realizes that her brother cannot take any more leave from his time on board his ship, that he is in the Navy, he has to go back, she just says, my nerves are shot. I know I promised Katy to take you to Switzerland and Germany, that we were going to be in Europe for another 6 months, that we were going to take a particular ship back, the same ship that we had come to Europe in, that, you know, she says her nerves are shot, and Katy is, of course, at first a little disappointed, but manages to be philosophical because she is Katy in the face of this and says, you know, you gave me 6 months in Europe. I got to go to London. I got to go to Paris and Nice and Rome and all sorts of places in Europe. You know, I have had a chance that I would never have had otherwise. And at the end of the book, when Clover is saying to Katy, I can't believe you're not more disappointed. I mean, you didn't get to finish seeing Europe. You were going to be there for 6 more months. I mean, the only nice thing about it, you know, you're saying that there were nice things about when Amy was being sick. I suppose there was Ned, and Katy blushes and flees, and Clover says, oh, is that what Katy's going to do next? So, yes. As you saw in that first picture, the bit of Ned handing Katy into a gondola with him, the two of them have a very, very romantic tete-a-tete in a gondola, which we don't get a word of because Susan Coolidge is very, very good at implying without, you know, flogging the point. She doesn't see any need to give us lengthy romantic palaver between two people. And so she doesn't. I think it's probably not one of her gifts, but in any event, Katy is engaged at the end of this. And, yeah, so this has my favorite bits even though my overall favorite book is the other one. And that's everything, and I will see you all next week.